When she showed up at the door, all she carried was a pan. She didn't say much. Just one line. "I don't talk much, but I can cook." The man hired her, but he had no idea. Her silence was a storm rooted in the past. And this ranch, it was no longer just land. It was destiny itself. Get ready for a journey that will touch your heart. By the way, we noticed something small. Most people who watch these stories aren't actually subscribed to the channel. Maybe we get caught up in the moment or just forget to hit the button. But your support truly helps us keep creating stories like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. The dust had hung in the air all day. Even as the evening chill settled in, the air still carried that dry fatigue you could feel with every breath. As the barn door creaked, Eric Weber was hunched over, trying to remove an old hinge. He squinted, working without paying any mind to the horizon where shadows had begun to stretch. Silence had become his most loyal companion in recent months. Aside from the ticking clock in the house, morning birdsong, and the wind rustling through bare branches, he hadn't heard a single sound in days. And then, something happened he wasn't supposed to hear. A knock on the door. Slow, steady, not desperate, not rushed. Eric stood up, set his tool aside, and walked toward the porch. His eyes tried to make out the silhouette standing at the door. First, the shape became clear, a slender woman. A worn dress fluttered in the wind around her. Clutched tightly to her chest was a copper pan, like a kind of armor. "I don't talk much, sir," the woman said, her voice rough but steady. "But I can cook." Eric studied the quiet storm standing at his door. Her hair was a mess, her cheeks streaked with dust, but her eyes were alive, unbroken. Her fingers were cracked, but she held that pan handle with such firmness it was as if letting go would mean losing the last thing keeping her tethered to the world. "What's your name?" Eric asked, his voice low and brief. "Clara," she said. It was barely a whisper, but it echoed in the stillness. Eric turned his head. No horse, no bags, no belongings. Just a dusty path she'd walked down with her own feet. And behind her, the silence of a past that swore to stay behind. "You got anyone?" he asked. Clara slowly shook her head. Her lips were cracked, but they didn't tremble. Silence. A long, steady stare. The wind squeaked the hinge on the door. Eric took a step back. "You're hired," he said. Then he looked down and added, "And this is your home now." Clara's shoulders dropped, but it wasn't defeat. It was the setting down of a burden she'd been carrying for far too long. A kind of surrender. A kind of beginning. She quietly stepped past Eric, her eyes scanning the porch roof, the chair, the crack above the door. As she crossed the threshold, she moved carefully, like she was stepping into an old memory. Inside, everything was in its place, but something was missing. The table was tidy, but it looked like no one had ever sat there. The stove was cold, but there was still a shovel leaning beside it. Clara turned around. "Where should I sleep?" Eric nodded toward the back of the kitchen. "There's a bed there. Clean sheets, water in the basin. We'll talk work in the morning. Tonight, just eat." As Clara walked alone, Eric stepped out to the porch and watched the last line of the sun disappear. The ranch was quiet. 2 chickens, an old horse, and an empty swing gently swaying. Then he stepped back inside, and for the first time, didn't lock the door. The house stayed silent through the night, but for the first time, it wasn't empty. Clara moved through the room without touching anything. On one wall, an old frame with a faded silhouette inside. At the edge of a pillow, a quilt with a few missing stitches, but sewn with care. When she caught her reflection in the dusty mirror, the past beneath her eyes was just as deep as the weariness. But tonight, she didn't have to run. For the first time, someone had given her something without asking for anything in return. But the night passed without sleep, because she kept waiting for the footsteps of the past to return to that porch. Because trust always comes with a test. And the first thing she did the next morning in the kitchen was wash her copper pan and throw wood into the stove. The first spark that hit the bottom of the pan sounded like the beginning of a new life. The morning chill had started to fade with the first light of the sun. Clara moved quietly in the kitchen. Everything still felt unfamiliar, but the warmth of the stove and the familiar weight of the pan brought some strength back to her hands. Before Eric woke up, she had already cracked 2 eggs, rekindled the stove with some dry hay, and wiped the windowsill in front of the kitchen window. The wood beneath the dust seemed like it had once sung. Now, It whispered to Clara's hands, "Wake up. I'm still here." When Eric appeared at the doorway, he was still wearing yesterday's shirt. The tips of his shoes were streaked with mud. His face didn't show sleepiness, but a wall built from habit. Still, the scent of eggs and bread lingering in the kitchen was cracking that wall. "You started early," he said, his voice husky like tobacco. Clara didn't say anything. She flipped the bread in the pan and, when the edge crisped, nodded toward the plates. Eric sat down, every move precise, like he knew he was being watched. When he took the first bite, something shifted in his face, a small moment of ease. Clara accepted that as enough and turned away, but Eric's eyes lingered on her back a little longer. After breakfast, Eric stepped outside. He would check the barn roof and look over the fences. Clara stayed inside and cleaned. She shook out the old rug on the floor, wiped the window glass, but her hands stopped when she found a small notebook in an old drawer. She opened it. Between the pages was a pressed flower, maybe lavender, maybe violet, still dry but vibrant. The word Clara wasn't written in it, but the sentences felt like they'd come from a woman who shared the same loneliness. Sometimes a person doesn't settle into a house when they step through the door, but when they hand someone a slice of bread. Clara's fingers trembled. The past of this house didn't just belong to Eric, but also to another woman, most likely his wife. And her traces were still here. In a cup, a pillow, a chair. Clara hadn't just stepped into a stranger's life. She'd become a neighbor to a ghost, one who had died, but never left. But the real ghost came that day. By noon, the wind had changed direction. Eric hadn't returned yet. When Clara stepped out to the porch for some fresh air, she saw a figure near the distant fence. A tall man, hat pulled low over his eyes, wearing an old coat. A bag on his shoulder, a stick in his hand. The man came closer to the fence, then stopped, like he was scoping out the area, deciding something. Clara's heart sped up. She squinted, but the wind made her eyes water. The man lifted his head. He saw Clara. He smiled slowly, but it wasn't a warm smile. It felt more like a familiar threat. Well, the man said, his voice distant but clear. "Didn't think you'd get this far." Clara's feet felt nailed to the porch. She knew that voice. This wasn't a dream. These were the footsteps of the past catching up to her. His name was Leon. Once, he had stopped at an inn, seen Clara stirring a pot by the stove, and hadn't taken his eyes off her since. First came sweet words, then gifts, then strange persistence. And the more Clara said no, the darker his expression grew. The night she escaped, she left a note. "I don't want to live between loneliness and threat." But apparently, to some men, the word no was just a silent challenge. Leon now stood by the fence, head tilted down, smiling. "Nice place," he said. "Got chickens? Or are you the one cooking the hen now?" Clara said nothing. She gripped the doorframe tightly. Her hand wanted to reach in and grab the small knife in the drawer by the stove, but her feet wouldn't carry her inside. Just then, a gunshot-like sound came from the barn side, like someone had slammed a board to the ground. Leon turned his head. Eric was coming out of the barn with a rifle on his shoulder. His coat was slung over one shoulder, his face expressionless. But his eyes were ice cold. Visitors talked from outside the fence. Eric said, his voice flat but clear. Leon tilted his head. "No need for violence, friend. Just saw an old friend," he said, mockingly. "You were wrong," said Eric. "She works here, and she's safe. Move along now." Leon stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he looked at Clara. "Running again?" He whispered. Only she could hear him now. She didn't reply. She just stared. Leon turned away, but as he left, he threw a final line over his shoulder. "This story ain't over yet, Clara." He vanished into the dust cloud. Eric didn't approach. He lowered the gun, but his shoulders were still tense. Clara, on the other hand, had let go of the doorframe. As she slowly lowered her hands, for the first time something stirred inside her. No more running. And maybe that day, the fire inside that kitchen was burning for the first time. Not just for food, but for a fight too. The next morning was colder. The sky had turned a pale gray, and a heavy silence hung over the ranch, like the sky itself was waiting for something. Clara was sitting by the stove, her hands deep in bread dough. Eric hadn't woken up yet, or so she thought, because there he was, standing in the kitchen doorway, half hidden in shadow, watching her. The hands working the dough were just as tangled as the thoughts in Clara's mind. The events of the day before had replayed in her head 1,000 times. Leon's voice, his smile, the way Eric had raised the rifle. But most of all, the look in Eric's eyes. It hadn't been just a rancher protecting someone who worked for him. It had been something deeper, like an old wound. Clara hadn't just seen herself in that look. She had seen a ghost from Eric's past. "You look like you didn't sleep," Eric finally said. Clara didn't lift her head, just kept kneading the dough. "Dreams. A little too loud last night." "Mine are quiet," Eric said, stepping inside and sitting at the edge of the table. "But they're more frightening." That short exchange turned out to be the longest conversation of the day. Afterward, Eric went outside. Clara lit the oven and leaned against the window while waiting for the stones to heat up. Her eyes landed on the far end of the fence. Where Leon had stood, there were still marks in the dirt, places where someone's heel had pressed hard into the ground, leaving a trace as they turned. Clara thought to herself, some marks never fade, but some are forgotten by building new paths over them. When the bread started to rise in the oven, Eric came back. He held a folded piece of cloth in his hands, his eyes more thoughtful than before. "What's that?" Clara asked. "An old map," Eric said. He spread it out on the table. It was yellowed from the wind, its edges darkened with burn marks. Roads, mountains, and a few notes were scribbled on it. Clara noticed some marked spots. One of them had an X. "This place?" Clara asked, pointing at the mark. Eric lowered his head. "A place that used to belong to me. Now it's just a ghost's home." Clara went quiet, and then Eric began to speak. Slowly, softly, in broken phrases. "Clara," he said, using her name for the first time. "I used to live with my family. Had a wife. A son. Small, but stubborn. This ranch was theirs. Or let's say, while they were alive, it was full of breath." Clara turned her head, listening. "One day, while we were gone, someone came. They raided the place. My wife fought back. My boy, he ran after her." Eric's voice cracked, but his face stayed still. "When I came back, all I had left was this map. I don't know where they were taken. There were no bodies. Just blood and footprints. That X is the last place I searched." Clara held her breath. The silence in the room now held more than sadness. It carried a buried rage, too. "So, did you ever go after them?" Clara asked. Eric nodded. "I did. For years. But then, I came back here. Sometimes waiting hurts less than searching." Clara placed her hand on the table. "Maybe. One day we can find a trace." Eric squinted. "Maybe." Then he stood up. "But for now, someone's found us." There was a sudden knock at the door. Hard. Quick. Like someone had run out of patience. Clara jumped, but Eric didn't hesitate. He reached for his rifle. When he opened the door, it wasn't Leon's face they saw, but one of his echoes. There were 3 men at the door. They didn't carry weapons, but their posture was threatening. The man in the center had a thin mustache, was neatly dressed, but his eyes were cold. "Mr. Weber?" he asked. His voice was polite, but underneath was an order. "Who's asking?" Eric replied. "My name is Keller," the man said. "We need to talk. About someone you might know. A man named Leon." Clara's chest tightened again. Eric stood in the doorway like a wall. "I don't know what this is about," Eric said. "But first, you tell me whose side you're on. Otherwise, this door stays shut." The man smiled. "Sometimes sides depend on which way the bread is cut. But don't worry. Leon has caused trouble, not just for us, but for plenty of others." Clara took a step forward, Eric glancing back at her. Her eyes were steady. "One question before you come in," Clara said. "Why are you looking for him?" The man turned to Clara. "Because he's not just looking for you. He took something, and we need to find it. Either him, or the woman he's tracking." Silence. Then Eric opened the door slightly. "You'll have some tea, but weapons stay outside." The man nodded. "Fair offer." As the 3 men took off their boots on the porch, Clara walked back inside. Her hands were still covered in flour, but her heart didn't feel as light as flour anymore. When Keller and his men entered the kitchen, the air was still thick with tension. Eric had placed the old kettle on the stove, but his gaze, just like his rifle, was still alert. Clara stood in the corner of the kitchen. Her eyes never left the men, but behind the silent mask she had built over the years, her true thoughts were hidden. Keller sat on the chair beside the stove. The other 2 remained standing. It was a clear display of power, relaxed but cautious. When his eyes turned to Clara, His voice softened, but the words were ice cold. Leon didn't just cling to a woman. He held on to a secret, he said. His connection to you may be personal, Clara, but with us, it's not. Eric's eyes immediately turned to Clara. What kind of connection? Clara looked away, then took a deep breath. The time has come, she thought. That threshold where silence no longer protects anyone. 2 years ago, she began slowly. I was working at a bakery in Junction Hollow. It didn't just smell like flour and sugar. There were other things in the back room. Envelopes, maps, coded conversations. Keller nodded. You were in the right place. Leon was the courier for that operation. He carried papers, but sometimes more than that. Clara continued. One night, I saw him drop an envelope between the floorboards of the bakery. I didn't open it, but it had my name on it. My name. He wanted to use me, Clara said, and for the first time, there was anger in her voice. He wanted to bring me into his system as someone who didn't carry messages, but wouldn't raise suspicion either. Supposedly just a lonely baker girl. But I ran. I burned that envelope in the stove. He's been after me ever since. Keller's eyes shifted from Clara to Eric. That's why being here could be dangerous. This man, he's no longer just obsessed. He's like the final link in a chain trying not to be followed. And even we don't fully know who's holding the other end. Eric gave a slight nod. Turning to Clara, he said, You didn't just run. You stopped him. That envelope probably held the key to everything. Clara slowly met Eric's eyes. But now he's here, and he saw this place. I'm not the only one in danger anymore. Keller pulled a small bundle of papers from inside his coat. If you help us, we can stop him. Maps, his suspected routes, old contacts. But he might start circling the ranch. You'll need to be ready. Eric took the papers, but his face didn't change. This ranch has never been ready for anything. But now, it has to be ready for everything. That night, Clara didn't cook. For the first time, she left the stove cold. Eric was out in the yard, reading through the documents Keller had given him, checking the blind spots in the fence corners. Clara sat in the kitchen's corner chair, holding the old notebook again. This time, she began writing on the blank pages. Maybe one day Eric would read them. Maybe there'd be no need. There are days when running keeps you alive, she wrote. But the day comes when fighting is the only way to live. Just then, a sound outside. It wasn't Eric's footsteps. Clara rushed to the window. The sky was starting to darken. A shadow was moving on the horizon, but it wasn't Leon this time. Someone else. Or others. Eric came in, quiet but quick. 3 riders approaching the fence, he said. They're not hiding. They want to be seen. Clara stood up. Eric's eyes had hardened. Weapons? Clara asked. Ready. But it starts with protecting you. The rest, we'll see together. The shadows near the ranch gate were growing. Silhouettes were becoming clear. One of them raised his head. He held a torch. Another had a long knife strapped to his belt. Clara whispered, Those are his men. Eric came up beside her. Then this house isn't just a home anymore, he said. It's a post. Eric's rifle was resting by the front door frame. Clara grabbed the knife by the stove. Now, it wasn't just the kitchen's fate in her hands, but the ranch's too. And that night, no bread was baked in the oven. But the fire inside the stove burned more alive than ever before. Night had fallen, but even the stars looked timid in the sky. The wind had changed direction, whipping the branches of the trees by the fence like lashes. The 3 riders approached the gate in silence, reins hanging loose. Eric stood waiting on the porch, his rifle resting against his shoulder, but his eyes locked on target without a blink. Clara was inside, positioned just behind the window. The old hunting knife that usually hung by the stove was now resting in her palm. Eric turned inside, his voice low but clear. They talk first. Then they attack. We're not going to listen. Clara nodded. There was no fear in her eyes, only focused determination. She was no longer someone who ran. She was someone who stayed. The fence gate creaked. The man in the center, Clara recognized him. Lucas. Leon's right-hand man. The same one who had once tried to push her into a freight wagon back in Junction Hollow. His eyes always had a wet glint, like he was stuck between laughter and madness. Tonight, he was smiling again, but there was no joy in it. Beautiful night, he said mockingly. Warm house, sweet smells inside. We figured we'd invite ourselves in. Eric said nothing. His silence was like a wall. Clara watched from behind the window. The men hadn't yet stepped past the fence. But one of the horses began pawing at the dirt. Nervous. Animals sometimes sensed what people try to hide. Leon, Lucas said, is coming back. You know that. But before he does, we came. Because he owes Clara a debt. And debts get ugly when they're late. Eric finally spoke. Men who talk about debts usually live off what they steal. There's nothing here for you. Lucas's face hardened. Then we'll take it the hard way. That's when it happened. Eric's rifle fired. The first rider dropped, his horse rearing back in panic. Clara had been waiting inside for Eric's shot. Now it was her turn. As one man charged toward the porch, Clara opened the back kitchen door. In one swift move, she hurled the pot of hot water she'd been holding. The boiling water hit the man's shoulder, and his scream tore through the air. Clara quickly pulled back. Eric leaned against a porch beam, took aim, and hit the second rider in the shoulder. Lucas cursed and jumped off his horse. "Enough," he shouted. "What did she ever do to you, huh?" "It was just a message, just a game." Clara stepped out the back door, knife in hand. Her face carried the same quiet expression that had always spoken louder than words. "I'm not a game," she said. "I cook. I clean. I heal. But if someone tries to use me like property, I burn." Lucas froze in surprise for a second. Eric had been waiting for that moment. He raised his rifle again, but this time he didn't shoot. "Go," he said. "Now, if you ever set foot on this land again, you'll be shot before your shadow arrives." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "Leon won't forget this." "Neither will I," Eric said. "But I'm not afraid anymore." The men pulled back, quietly, within a collapse, forced to return to Leon and report what happened. But tonight, they had lost. Clara stepped onto the porch, knife still in hand. Eric looked at her. "You okay?" Clara nodded, but her eyes were full. "I didn't do it for you," she said. "I just knew I wasn't going to keep running for myself anymore." Eric stepped closer. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "If anyone tries to hurt you, you won't fight alone anymore. I'm here too." In that moment, something changed in Eric's eyes. Not hardness, softness, like a crack forming in ice. And Clara realized then, this man wasn't just a widower. He was a father, a husband, and most of all, someone who didn't want to replace the family he lost, but couldn't stand the emptiness any longer either. The next morning, Eric was on horseback, riding toward the distant mountain road. Clara stood on the porch, watching him. Before leaving, Eric had pressed an old piece of paper into her hand. A scrap of a map. Lucas said something. Eric had told her the night before. "While Leon was tracking you, he was tracking me too. There's an old cabin marked on the map. My family might have been kept there." Clara smoothed out the paper in her hands. This story wasn't just hers anymore. It was a story of two lonely people, reshaped in the fire of the past. And now, they were walking straight into the heart of it. Together, the wind had woken up early that morning. The chill sweeping over the valley tousled Eric's horse's mane, revealing the old hunting cabin up ahead. The building was nearly collapsed, its roof sagging, walls covered in moss. But Eric's eyes weren't on the structure. They were fixed on the corner of the clearing behind it, a small area circled with stones. He rode toward it. Clara was walking behind Eric. She hadn't taken a horse. She'd chosen to walk. Every stone under her feet reminded her how she had gotten here, how many paths she'd taken, and how much she had left behind. When they reached the stone circle behind the cabin, Eric knelt down. He reached between the stones and pulled out an old metal box. It was rusty. There was no lock. Inside was something wrapped in a piece of cloth, a small wooden toy, and a piece of paper, a few lines written in a child's handwriting. "If you find me, I still love you. L." Eric's hands trembled. "Leo, my son's name was Leon. But this Leon can't be the same person. Can he?" he whispered. Clara stepped closer. "Maybe. Not the same person, but someone who followed the same lie." Just then, a shadow appeared from inside the cabin. Eric reached for his rifle, but Clara raised her hand. "Don't," because the one approaching was Leon himself. His eyes were bloodshot. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't armed, but kept both hands in his pockets. His face showed a weariness Clara had never seen before. Not defeated, but drained. "You came," he said. "You really came." Eric stepped forward. "Why did you bring me here?" Leon looked at Clara. "Because this woman isn't just my past. She's your future." Clara frowned. "What are you talking about?" Leon licked his lips. "I didn't take Eric's family, but I knew where they were. Years ago, a boy, crying near a cabin. His name was Leo, but he didn't remember his family. They took him somewhere. I was there, watching. That boy. Eric's eyes widened. The age fits. But what happened next? Leon lowered his head. They sold him, cleared a debt with him. By the time his family returned, it was too late. The boy grew up under a different name. But one day, in a bakery, when I saw Clara, she reminded me of someone from that family. Maybe a sister. Maybe a door back to the past. That's when the obsession started. Because from then on, I was chasing the past, not the future. Eric's rifle was still on the ground. Clara stepped forward. You could have helped that child. But instead, you wrote yourself a story and trapped us inside it. Leon nodded. Maybe, but it's over now. Then he reached into his pocket. Eric moved for his gun, but Clara stopped him again. Because Leon had only pulled out a letter. And an old necklace. Leo always carried this. He said it was a keepsake from his mother. Eric looked at the necklace. That tiny locket in his palm. It was the same one he'd once seen around his wife's neck. Clara held her breath. You knew my son, Eric said. Is he alive? Leon closed his eyes. Last I heard, 6 years ago he was in a village. But now, finding him is up to you. My part ends here. Then, before turning to leave, he handed Eric the letter. Maybe your son's looking for you, too. He turned and walked away. Eric didn't stop him. Neither did Clara. Because some battles are won in silence. And some travelers carry their sentence on their backs. When they returned, the ranch was still standing. The chicken coop was quiet, the stove cold. But inside, Clara lit the fire again. Eric sat on the porch and opened the letter. Clara came out after pouring some coffee. What does it say? Eric placed the letter in his palm. Dad, it says, but I'll read the rest later. Clara stayed quiet for a moment, then walked into the kitchen. The pan was still sitting in the corner. She washed her hands, tied up her hair, put on her apron, grabbed the flour. What are you doing? Eric called from inside. Clara smiled. Biscuits. For today, instead of more words. Eric stood up and came inside. He leaned his shoulder against the edge of the pan. Today's a good day to begin. Clara squinted at him. And to hope for tomorrow. That day, it wasn't just biscuits baking on the stove. A house built in silence finally became a home. And Clara was no longer just a woman who could cook well. She became a story that showed what it means to love without speaking. As for Eric, he became the witness to how a man's loneliness can melt in the heat of a kitchen fire. We're just a few steps away from reaching our first 1,500 subscribers, our growing family. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you to everyone who's brought us this far. With your support, we grow stronger with every story. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the perfect time.